So a little bit about me. I'm Marion Forester. I am from the Kingdom of the Outlands currently. I have lived in North Shield, Middle, and Callantyre. I've been in the SCA for about 20 years now, been doing scribal stuff for about 15, and paintbrushes and pigments have been my area of study for about 4 years now. And a little bit of fun trivia, I am the Outlands Kingdom ANS champion until we finally get another event. So yay me. So what we're going to do today is be talking about how to make paintbrushes according to Cennini's instructions. And we're going to go through first how to make one with squirrel, which is quite a bit easier. And then we'll go through with a weasel tail. And I'm going to be using Sable. And if you know anything about good brushes, Sable is where you want to be. But first, we're going to go through a little bit of the history and the research that I've done. So first of all, we're going to start out in this book. The Brussels manuscript, which was written by a painter named Pierre Lebrun in 1635, refers to paintbrushes as pencils. And you're going to see that a lot if you do research on paintbrushes. And Lebrun says that the brush head needs to be made of a soft kind of hair, but which has sufficient resistance to keep itself straight and to make a firm point for painting. He then lists the animals that provide fur that meet these requirements, and those are bear, marten, or similar animals, so any kind of weasel, hog, and fishes. And in this book, fishes is annotated to say probably seal. I think it could very well be some sort of water-loving species of the weasel family, maybe an otter, or maybe they're maybe fisher or something like that. A couple of manuscripts written in the Middle Ages, and they're written in Middle English, and you can find them, whoops, in this book. They say that a paintbrush, again, is a pencil, and says that it is made of squirrel tail. And next we have On Diverse Arts, which many of you may know. It's a pretty, if you're going to buy a book, it's a pretty cheap one. In the area mentioning stained glass, it says that paintbrushes are made with the hair from the tail of a marten, badger, squirrel, or cat, or from the mane of a donkey. And then the last one of that I found is a very proper treatise. And there, this one was published in 1573 by Richard Tottle, and it calls for a pencil made of gray amice or caliper tails when applying size for gilding. And through the research that I've done, I figure amice is either a gray squirrel or a marten, and caliber probably refers to squirrel from the Calabria region of Italy. But what we're going to be working with most today is this book, which if you're into Scribble, I highly suggest it. It's not that expensive. The Craftmans Handbook, written by Cennini, and that is from 1437 Italy. And that is the only manuscript that I found that actually gives you instructions on how they were made. Every other place tells you what they were made of, but not how they were made. So we're going to his instructions, but first, let's talk about what a paintbrush is. A little bit of terminology. So this part we're going to refer to as the brush head. That's the part you use to paint with. And then we have the part that connects, and this is the ferrule, and that connects your brush head to your handle. And let's see, and things you will need if you want to make your own paintbrushes. So first, let's start with the stick. I like to use small dowels. You can get them at a craft store, at a woodworking store, something like that. And they're pretty cheap. I found some at Dollar Tree here, a package of like 20 of them. And what I've done to make them useful for what I'm doing and to follow Cennini's instructions is to make them spindle shaped. And I just did that on a belt sander. If you really want to, you can do it by hand, but that's going to take a bit longer. And if you really want to be authentic, you can go out and collect your own stick and whittle it down to good shape.
Just interrupt. We had a question in regards to hair. So here in Australia, we have some issues with and we don't necessarily have all the European animals. And the question is, what kind of hair can we use here in Australia without having to, I mean, the question is buy resources, but I'm guessing that she's meaning like international, more period things. Do you have any idea of equivalents?
I am not quite sure what you guys can get down there.
Well, I was thinking more like equivalent. So like the two that you're saying is there. So for instance, like with fur, you would have like rabbit being the lesser person's equivalent of the otter kind of thing.
Yeah, you could definitely try it. I'm not sure if it's going to be quite strong enough. I don't know if it would maybe be a little bit more soft, but you can definitely try it. I suggest trying whatever you can get for a while and seeing how it works. Okay, so let's go on to the next thing, which would be feathers. And you can use a lot of different kinds of feathers. And what I find makes a good size is duck feathers. And that is because we have a nice long clean area here. If it looks opaque, you can't use that. It's not going to be open. You want it so that it's translucent on the bottom. And you're also kind of looking at what kind of a paintbrush do you want. Do you want one that's very fine or very thick? So look at the diameter of your feather. This one is from a turkey. And sometimes you get a bad batch of feathers and they don't have anything for you to use. It's all broken off. So be very careful what you get. Let's see. Next, we can talk about a little about the furs. So yeah, I don't know exactly what you're going to be able to get where you are, because I know people are from all over. This one is squirrel. This one is going, and if you look, it's all long hairs, which is great, but your better brushes are going to be from a water animal. And this is sable. This one's mink. And if you can tell, the sable and the mink have long guard hairs and they have fluff underneath. And you can't use the fluff, you can only use the guard hairs. So while this one, we can just cut it off and use it as is. This we have to do a little bit more processing and it takes a little bit more time, but it makes a better brush, I think. Next, we have thread, and I use a wax thread. I get mine off of Amazon, but wherever you can find a nice larger sized waxed thread or just a thread. And that's going to be to tie your hair bundles together. And you're going to need something to stick everything together. I like to use fish glue from John Neal. And John Neal is a great place to get stuff. It's also something that if you have it in your scribble kit, you can use it for gilding and that kind of stuff. So it's multi-purpose. I'm also going to be using a little bit of gum arabic, and this is liquid gum arabic. You should be able to get it at any art store. Look by like the Paintbrushes and that kind of thing.
Sorry to interrupt, Marion. What weight thread?
I am not sure. All I know is it's a little bit thicker. It's not like sewing thread, more like thread you might use for making shoes. And if you want to condition your brush handle, you can use some wax. That's just beeswax. And then to kind of clear out your feather, you're going to use either a big needle or a toothpick, or just something that'll fit in there. And then a scissors, and very important, a piece of paper or a card or something. And on here it says tip and cut end, and your hairs are tapered. So if you want a nice tapered brush, like you can tell this is wider at the bottom, comes to a nice tip, you need your threads, or you need your fur to keep that taper. So you want all of the tip ends at one end and all of the cut ends close to the skin at the other. And we'll go through that as we go. So we'll do the squirrel first because that's the easiest. But your first step is going to be to put your feathers into a cup of water. And then what that's going to do is soften the shaft of the feather. And when you cut it, it will keep it from splintering and shattering, and you'll get a much better cut. So what I'm going to do is, very important to always hold on to the part you want to keep when you're cutting. So I'm going to cut the top of it off because the part I wasn't holding flew away. And then I'm going to cut the other end to create a tube. And right now there is a little membrane in there. It's probably a little hard to see. But what we're going to do is take a needle and push that little membrane out. And with duck feathers, it seems to come right out usually. Sometimes you have to kind of get in there and scrape it out, but you should have a nice open tube when you're done. Next, we're going to collect some fur to make our paintbrush. And you can tell I've kind of been using these for quite a while and for different classes because they look pretty chewed on, but you can use these for quite a while. And I get my furs online. The squirrel fur around here is used for making fishing lures and flies and that kind of thing. So you can get it on the internet pretty easy. Getting sable or mink or something like that is quite a bit harder. Okay, so we have a nice little bundle of hairs here. And I'm not even going to put this down because this is pretty easy. So we're going to take one of our pieces of thread and we're going to tie it. Now this is the hardest part. This takes a little finesse and a little bit of practice, especially when you get to the other kinds of fur. We're going to get it about middle-ish. And we're going to tie a few more knots. That'll help it stay knotted, but it will also help it fit into the ferrule. And you want it a little, you want it to be able to fit into your feather shaft or your ferrule pretty tightly so that it's not sliding around. And if it doesn't fit, you either, if it's too large, pull out some hairs, or if it's too small, tie a few more knots. So there we have approximately our little bundle, and we're going to dip it into our water. And what that does is it brings all the hairs together. So instead of a fuzzy little bundle, you have a nice straight tip, which is going to come in handy when we put it through the feather shaft. And this is another place where your needle or toothpick are a good idea because you can push right at the knot and then push it through to the length that you want. And with the squirrel, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of fur and your threads sticking out the back end. So what we're going to do is, I want it a little bit shorter, so I'm going to pull it back just a bit. And I'm going to cut off all the things that are sticking out. And then we can push it back in. And then our last step is to take one of our sticks and to take our fish glue, and we just dip it into our fish glue just a little bit. You don't need a whole lot. So it's just from there on. I'm going to take a little off even. And then we're going to just stick it together. And you might have a little bit squishing out, and just take that away. I find the squirrel makes a really good liner brush. It's really soft. It's not quite as strong as the mink or the sable. And if you want, you can condition it with a little bit of wax, just kind of rub it on, and then rub it in with your fingers and kind of warm it up and get it in there. But we have a finished paintbrush. So now we're going to go through and make a sable paintbrush. And that's a little bit more complicated, but not much. Just one extra step. So we will take our sable here. And these you have to kind of get a smaller clump and grab it and cut it as close to the skin as you can, because we want as much length as possible, because these are quite a bit shorter than the squirrel. And the extra step is that we have to take all of the fluff out. So we just grasp the tips of the guard hairs and pull out the fluff. And it'll also grab any of the really short guard hairs. We're going to kind of look through here and make sure we don't have any weird bent hairs. But then we have our little clump, and this is where our card is important. So we're going to lay that down because we need to get several more clumps out of this. And if anybody has a question, this is a great time because this takes a minute or so. Grabbing the guard hair and pulling out the fluff. And we just keep doing that until we have enough for our brush.
Is your fish glue from a fish tackle shop?
My glue is from John Neal Booksellers. It was used in period for doing gilding in some of the gesso recipes. And it's still used somewhat for that today. But wherever, you can use any kind of glue, honestly. I just picked that as one because I knew it was something that they would have. And it was something that I already had for making gesso. And we'll do one more clump or so, and then we can tie it off. This is kind of a big clump, but it'll work. And I have not had any problems with my brushes. I think the fish glue is a little bit water soluble, but I don't leave my brushes in water, so I've never had one come apart. And I've used them on projects before. We'll get one more clump here. And if you are collecting wild fur make sure that you treat it somehow. Either boil it, which sounds like it was very period. There's a mention of the fur being cooked, which I'm assuming that they meant boiled. And that seems to not only kill any little beasties that are in your stuff, but also it seems to make a slightly better fur. Okay, so we have our clump here. It looks pretty good. And we're gonna do one more step. I have an empty container here. I'm gonna put this in, tip down, and I'm gonna tap it and kind of roll it so that I can get all of the hairs about at the same length. I'm usually not too worried about this with the squirrel because it's a cheaper material and I don't think that it makes quite as nice of a brush, so I'm not too worried about that. And by rolling it, you're going to get a nicer clump of hairs here. And then we can just kind of roll that out into our hand so that we can tie it off. And again, I'm going to take my thread and again, this is the hardest part, and tie it off about at the middle and put a couple extra ties in there. And to get a really good brush, you're going to have to do a little bit of practice, but you can get a serviceable one out of 1 or 2 tries. And then instead of dipping this into water, we're going to dip it into the liquid gum arabic. And that is going to help our little fur stay together while we push it through the ferrule. Also, if you're traveling, it'll keep them in a nice point. So we get a bit on there, and then we just kind of shape our brush head. And make it into a nice tapered shape. And we can kind of let that dry for a minute while we get a feather. And let's see, try and find the right size. Again, hold the piece you want to keep, cut it off, cut it at the tip, and then take out the membrane in the middle. And that one's kind of wet. There we go. So our tube is nice and empty. Shape my brush head just a bit better here. And that's going to help it stay when we push it through. Otherwise, you're going to have a whole bunch of hairs trying to stick out the sides. And we'll push it in. Oh, I got some sticking out here. And if you have a few sticking out, that's fine. They'll get where they need to be. Oh, had a little bit of membrane left in there. Oh, come on. Haha. So now we have our fur sticking out. We've got a little bit of string out the other side. Cut him off. Grab our stick. Oops, not that one. The glue. And stick it together. Ta-da, you got a brush. And these seem to make much better detailed brushes. You can get them a little bit shorter and the tip is stronger, it seems. And that is my main presentation. So any questions? This is a great time.
ask these orderly if you want to. We've had one question. How long do they last, Marion?
I've had, the ones that I've had have lasted several projects. I've never had one really break down yet. The worst calamity that usually comes to them is the cats get to them because they're made of fur and fish and they like the smell. But I've never actually had one break down on me yet.
Another question, why do you use the gum instead of the water? Is it extra stickiness for shorter fur?
It is definitely stickier, and it will leave that nice stickiness on there for quite a while. And it's also water soluble. So when you go to paint, you just dip it in your water and it'll wash right off. If anything, it'll add a little bit of gum arabic to your paint, and that's not a big deal either.
And how long to let the glue dry before use?
It's just kind of there to help everything stay together. So, I mean, I can use this right now. And let's see here. I'll flip my little card over and you can kind of see how it works. Maybe not the darkest color I could have used. Let's see. Grab a little ultramarine. So that is the sable. So I can make fine detail and I can do nice thick application.
I had another question asking whether water isn't, because the fur is water resistant, it's water can't stick the fur together enough to get it into the ferrule. Is that correct? Or
that's probably a very good thing. It also just seems to be a little bit, yeah, that's probably a very good hypothesis as to why it doesn't stick together very well with just the water. And here's the squirrel. Again, you can make a really fine, nice line, and I think it makes a great liner brush.
and there's a question is whether the making paintbrushes out of feathers has not been seen in the extant manuals. Is there any evidence? I think you said that was in this Cennini book.
Yes, they give kind of step-by-step instructions, and I believe I've given a nice, I think I've, in the handout, it should say exactly what the instructions were. Let's see here. And let's see. And you're going to be looking for the chapter on how to make miniver brushes.
Oh, the question is actually that, sorry to interrupt, Marion, it's the feathers for the brush bit as opposed to hair for the brush bit.
I have never seen any documentation for using a feather as a brush head. I know there's a video going around where a reenactor does that, and I've never found any evidence of it, but I mean, if it works, go for it.
May I comment?
Yes, please.
The video came from a well-respected group in England that was doing workshops, things like that. And they said, we wonder if. Well, because the video was put around, they came back and said, no, there's no evidence of this ever having been done. It really was I wonder if.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, can you hear me? This is Hillary from Onstiora.
Yep, you're good, Hillary.
Okay, good, because I can't ever hear myself coming back. The video, it was a archaeologist, and she was doing some monastery growing things out in the field, and her husband did this supposed if you take a feather and make a very fine tip using the feather on it. When a bunch of scribes, not just the SCA, but I mean professional calligraphers contacted them, turns out he admitted that he made it up. There was no historical on it, and they made it up, and unfortunately they'd already cast the video, so they were not able to go back and do any kind of addendum to the video. So yeah, there's no documentation, there's no iconography, there's no images anywhere that say
Yeah.
that you use the tip of a feather for the brush tip. So stick with the fur.
Yep. And one other thing, sometimes you'll see in manuscripts where they've wrapped thread around the outside, and sometimes you won't. And there's one manuscript, I can't remember what it is, that has both wrapped around the outside and nothing on the outside. So if you want to wrap a little bit or tie a few knots around the outside, that's fine. But as far as I can find, it's an option.
And do you have any problems with the hollow bit of the feather when painting?
I haven't. Usually you're just using the very tip, so I haven't had any problems with that. And it seems like waterfowl seems to work the best for the feather part, but I'm not sure why that is, or seems to just be kind of a common thing. And duck works really well. I've tried a little bit of turkey, and that's fine, but those are usually too big of brushes for what I'm using.
And is there any reason not to use discarded quills such as peacock?
If you can find it, give it a try. Again, if you're picking something up, I highly suggest treating it somehow. Sometimes there's mites or bird lice or something on there. So either stick it in the freezer for a few days or something like that, just to kill any little beasties. Also, if you're collecting anything that like a wild goose or something like that, please beware of the laws in your area for collecting those kind of things. In the United States, you may run into some problems with the Migratory Bird Act. So be careful with that.
And I'll just correct myself. Mr. Rowan was actually asking if you are basically reusing feathers that you have previously used as a pen in the scribing.
I haven't. You need quite a bit of it. I usually use at least an inch, usually in about 1.5 inches. So I think if you're going to use it for a pen first, you'd only be able to get maybe 1 or 2 cuts out of it. You wouldn't be able to get it very far. Also, the feathers that I use are a lot smaller than you'd usually be using for a pen, unless you're doing like detail work or something like that, or a very small script. So I have not used it as a pen first, but give it a try.
All right, well, we've got half an hour to go. Does anybody have any questions or anything else? Or Marion, is there something that you would, does anyone want to see Marion do one again? Sorry, Marion.
No, that's fine.
There's a question that would left
Yes, please.
challenge in reusing pens.
Can you repeat that?
So would leftover ink be a challenge in reusing pens?
I don't think it would interfere. It might look a little odd, but Ian, do you have any comments as to why there would be a problem?
I can foresee a couple of problems, but I'm more or less with you. I don't think it would be a big deal. The problems that I see is it's going to depend on the ink you used. If the ink is an iron gall ink, then when iron gall ink dries, you're fine. It's not going to have its acidic qualities. It's not going to do anything. When it gets re-wet, it can get back to being acidic, and that could potentially have an effect on the hairs in the brush and cause it to break down. But that's really the biggest problem I potentially see, and I don't think it'd be that big of a deal. If your ink is a modern ink, they're pretty neutral, and so I wouldn't say that there'd be a problem with that at all. Just my thoughts.
You know, I do a quill class, this is Hillary again, on how to make quills, and I buy inexpensive turkey feather quills, which have a very large size barrel or a decent barrel. They look pretty much like what you have for the duck quills. And they're, you know, $2 or $3 for a pack of 6 or 7. So I wouldn't get hung up on trying to use old quills to make feather, I mean, you know, to make brushes. Just go buy some new quills.
Yeah, and
start fresh and clean, and then you don't have any problems.
exactly. And the duck feathers that I use, they're like, I don't know, $5 for 20 or 30 of them. So it's not a big deal.
Anybody know what the average going price for feathers is in Australia and New Zealand?
Well, I think it varies. Like likewise, if you go into the art shop, you can get like your packets of feathers for maybe about $5.
Yeah, and they usually come from China.
Yeah.
Yep.
Probably the same place that it's coming from.
Yeah, and if you want stronger quills, I mean, you can look at some of the ones from John Neal, and they're using the goose, and they have a thicker, stronger barrel. So, you know, I'm sure you have some sort of bird there in Australia, and if you're following the rules and the regulations, you know, you've got a good hunter during hunting season, and you can get some feathers from them at that point. Then it's not poaching, and you're putting something to good use if you want stronger barrels.
Yeah, we've had a question saying, when the source said cat hair, does that mean domestic cat?
I'm assuming so. I have not terrorized my cats yet, but that's what I'm assuming. But I mean, I could definitely see using like lynx or bobcat or whatever wild cat that was around. But you know, if you have a cat around, and especially if it had an unfortunate demise, I could see harvesting from a domestic cat as well.
To harvest from a domestic cat, you don't need it for me to dead. Trust me on this.
True. You're going to give your cat a weird haircut, but...
Oh, they just shed. I've got a white cat, and he sheds on everything. And it's not even like a long hair cat either. It's kind of like sort of medium short sort of thing, and it's just like hair everywhere.
Yeah, you're going to need the long guard hairs, though, not the fluffy stuff. And gathering those might be a little bit difficult, especially keeping them at the right, with the tapered end at one end and the other.
So a couple people asked if we could do the feather, the brushes again, and I was wondering if you could do maybe the sable one. I think that's the more complicated one.
Yeah, we can definitely do the more complicated one again.
And they also asked if you could do it a bit slower, especially on the wrapping bit.
Oh, sure. I will try and go as slow as I can and not drop stuff everywhere. So what we're doing is we grab it pretty far down, take a nice cut as close to the skin as you can, and grasp the guard hairs here. And then with your other hand, you're pulling out all the fluff. And it takes a little while. And If you have somewhere to put your fluff, that's a great idea. Otherwise, it's going to be all over your work surface or your cat or your child. And lay it down. So this was the end near the skin. This was the nice tapered end. And grab some more. Nice close to the skin. So you cut it. Make sure we're at a good length here. Grab the guard hairs, pull out the fluff.
Someone asked, how tightly do you need to bundle the hairs? Does the smaller the bundle make a finer brush?
Yeah, if you have a smaller bundle, you're definitely going to have a finer, smaller brush head. If you want a big wash brush, you're going to need a whole lot. Let's see. And like with the mink, the one problem with the mink as opposed to the sable is that the guard hairs are a lot shorter. Oh, and I got a little bit too close there and got some skin there. And that won't let me pull out the fur. Yeah, so you want to make the size of brush head, or the size of bundle for the size of brush head that you want, whether you're doing detail work, wash brush, whatever. And you're going to get a nice point no matter what you do because your hairs are tapered. And that looks pretty good. Oh, we got a little bit of fluff in here yet. And I know there's another person who has done quite a bit of research into paintbrushes, and she uses a lice comb to take out all of that under fur. If you want to do that, that's fine. If you just want to get your stuff together and make a brush a little bit quicker, that's fine too. So I've got my fur in my little container. I've got the tips down here, and this was the end near the fur. So I'm going to tap it and just kind of roll it.
Marion,
Yes.
it doesn't matter what it's made out of. It's just a nice little tub.
Yeah, yeah. I just use these because these are something I have on hand for making, or for putting pigments in when I'm done making them. So you just want something that you can tap to kind of get all of the brushes or all of the hairs, the ends at about the same length. And then kind of roll it to get it into a nicer clump. And then gently roll it out. And now the ends are a lot closer together. They're not all different lengths. And then the hard part, I've got my thread here. And however it works for you, this is not an easy process. Let's see. I've got about maybe 6 inches here, and I don't know what that is in centimeters. And I've got a little loop here. I'm just going to pull that tight. About halfway. Doesn't have to be precise. You want to pull that pretty tight so it's not going to fall apart when you push it through your feather. And then a couple more knots. Come on. Oh, we got a loop. And when I do in-person classes, this is the part where most people have the hardest time, because it is kind of hard to do when you're holding with one finger and trying to do the loop with the other.
Any tips for that, or it's just pretty much it's practice makes perfect?
Exactly. It takes a little bit of dexterity and a little bit of practice. And I've done this probably 100 times now.
And it's been asked,
And
any benefit to thicker thread?
Let's see. If you have problems with your brush head being a little bit too small for your feather, if it's not fitting in there tight, I could see using a thicker thread. I like this because it seems to be just enough to kind of wedge it in there, but not too much that it's kind of obstructing it. If you have too thick of a thread, you're not going to be able to fit it into your feather. And I think being wax thread, it helps it kind of stick in there as well.
And could you do this with a bristle holding buddy, or does that make it more complicated?
What's that?
Basically, rather than having just yourself trying to get around holding it, can you do it with someone else holding the bristles for you?
Oh, absolutely. If you have a buddy, go ahead. Yes, please. If that works, if you have somebody and it works for you, do it. I usually don't have help when I'm doing it, so. And again, I'm dipping it into the gum arabic, which is going to make it nice and sticky. And it's also going to protect my brush head if I'm traveling or something, if I'm giving these away as largesse or something. And if you are giving them away as largesse, I highly suggest like a box for a necklace or something. That seems to be just about the right size to put a paintbrush in. And it has something soft to kind of keep it from moving around and bumping and crushing your brush head.
I have a couple of questions for you myself, Marion.
Sure.
Just going back to the gripping, like the buddy, could you use like a bulldog clip, so that if you don't have a buddy, you've got a way to essentially a machine to hold it yourself, or would that damage the fur too much?
I'm thinking that it may not keep it in a nice little clump for you. It may be a little bit more difficult. I'm not sure.
But you're making a round brush, so you want it to, if you're
Yeah.
using something to hold it, then it might make it flat.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'm just trimming my feather so that I have my tube, and then pushing the membrane out.
I think, Leonore, that a wooden cloth peg would be the same thing, that it would possibly flatten the bristles out. Although
Yeah.
I expect that if you use tissue in there, it's like it's not just purely the peg, that would be a way to sort of keep them round, because even I think sort of gripping yourself could in some ways flatten it out, because like your fingers still will sort of flatten.
Yeah, a little bit.
And the other thing is, I know that I asked you before in regards to sort of equivalent animal furs, and that you are making period paintbrushes, but are there any sort of period sort of equivalents that you could, so for instance, give as largesse to someone who is a vegan, or who's for whatever reason doesn't want animal products?
Let's see. I know that modern brushes most of the time are made with nylon, but I'm not quite sure where you would get the nice tapered nylon to make a good brush. And I'm not sure how you would do that.
I was thinking more of like a plant-based thing, like for instance, flax, or some of the leaf kind of things?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. It's a good question.
I was doing some quick research on that this last week. And interestingly, what I ran across was Australian Aboriginal techniques for paintbrushes, and they were using palm tree fibers, coconut fibers, and a bunch of other things. So that
Interesting.
information is available. I don't know if it would work for us. They were using it for body paints.
Huh. Yeah, so I've just shoved it through there, and I'm going to trim off the strings. That's just to kind of make it look nicer. If you stuffed your brush in there without trimming the strings, that would be fine too.
And we've had a comment too, just back in regards to the vegan one, that they would find things that would naturally shred as acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I could even see maybe, I know you can make fibers out of nettle. Probably wouldn't be the most fun, but, and dip it in our glue. And our final assembly is just sticking it in there. All done.
Very cool. Well, it's 10 minutes to the next class. Are there any last questions for Marion? And it's been pointed out by Mr. Rowan that nettle and flax don't have enough spring for brushes.
That makes sense.
So anyone, any last questions? No, but you're getting lots of compliments there, Marion.
And if anybody wants to see another class that I teach, I'm teaching tomorrow, 2 hours later, and I'm doing trade of medieval pigments and artist materials.
And if anyone wants the handout from this, it's on the Known Worlds website.
And the handout also has my email and my blog on it. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions or if you want to show off something that you've made.
And I've just put the link into the chat once again,
Perfect.
so that all those who came in later can just grab the link right now. And thank you to the gentle who posted that up earlier in the chat as well.
I posted also that if you go to YouTube and look for Windsor and Newton, who is the paint company, they have some videos on there on how they make their brushes, which is
Yeah, yeah, and it's very
watch these
similar.
women, it's very similar. The only difference is they're not using a feather quill; they're using a metal barrel. So
Exactly.
for the most part.
Yep.
So it's very similar. Technology hasn't changed much.
No, no.
Any more questions, folks, or otherwise I will stop recording the class. Nope. Alrighty.